Perfect. All right, I'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. Start off with just a roll call. McKee here, Schultz.
Here.
Bottom.
Present.
Varenkamp.
Here.
Nichols.
Here.
Perfect. Then we'll hand it off to Kendra, I assume, for the residential zoning district ordinance updates for urban conservation subdivisions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have a couple quick slides and then back to you. So next slide, Brad. This is a follow-up to the August 26th meeting. As you recall, we wanted to have a developers roundtable, and Steph Griffin from Soterra and Jason Osberg from Creative Communities came and visited with us in person. And then Dave Patberg from Centra Homes provided written comments for you. And I put a copy of the meeting minutes in the packet, as well as Dave's comments again. And at the end of the meeting, council said, had a little bit of discussion, but really just said, we want to think about this and come back. And it took a while to get back together, but we're back now. The next slide, Brad, the key elements in the draft. This is the same draft that was in the August packet. It allows an option for the urban conservation development in the low-density land use category only, and it would apply as an allowed subdivision in the RSF2 and RSF3 zoning districts. And in both of those districts, it would allow single-family and two-family homes by right, meaning just as a plat. And then in the RSF3 district, projects would, the RSF3 district would also allow townhome projects with a conditional use permit. So that does have an extra layer, but would still allow the single and two-family option. It has no minimum lot size or lot width for the parcels. We did establish some setbacks in the draft that are smaller than the standard RSF2 and RSF3 setbacks, but felt like we needed to have something in there. The nature of the density cluster will make it very difficult to meet our garage frontage requirements, so we're waiving that specifically in this draft. And then the open space preservation, we spent a fair amount of the time at the last, at that developer roundtable, I think, talking about this. 25% open space is required. So 25% of the net land area is required to be deeded as open space. You can deed more than that acreage, but only the upland area will be used to calculate that 25%. And those would typically be dedicated as open space, unless deeded to the city as public park, and that was one of the things we talked about a fair amount at that work session, and I think was one of the things you wanted to discuss this evening. And then it has the similar language to the OS&P ordinance today, which is no more than 2 non-contiguous parcels, meaning we really want this in a big chunk, but understand that every site's different, so if they did need to be separated, you still couldn't have more than 2 of those open space areas. The project area is still shown as a 20-acre minimum lot size so that we can get a more meaningful chunk of open space. That'd be a 5-acre parcel of permanent open space and a conservation easement. And then we did write in the ordinance draft that that the open space could be used for park dedication, subject to some specific standards, and that's something that we certainly should talk about this evening as we move forward with that as a possibility. Next slide. So tonight, we're bringing it back to you. We are asking the council to direct us to either make changes to come back again with another draft, or make edits and schedule for a public hearing at the Planning Commission. The earliest we could schedule that would be the January 6th Planning Commission meeting for council action on January 27th. And so that's my brief update. Happy to answer any other questions. Otherwise, look forward to hearing feedback from the council.
Sounds good. Appreciate it. Brad, could we go back a couple slides? There was just kind of some of the lists that she was going through.
This one here?
What's the next one?
Just
Oh, okay, go back one. Yeah, just if we could leave that up so we can reference it. Anyone want to start us off with what they're thinking?
I had 2 things.
Go for it.
First question is, I know we talked about RSF2 and RSF3. One would allow twin homes, one would allow townhomes. Mechanically, how would we go about defining whether something is RSF2 versus 3? Is there like a zoning change that happens at the time of preliminary plat where we go from the holding zone to one of the residential zones?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, council member. Yeah, so if it is outside of that initial phase of the sewer staging plan in the urban reserve district, it would require a rezoning from urban reserve to either RSF2 or RSF3. Both are compatible with that low-density residential land use category. If it was already guided low-density residential and zoned RSF2, they could request RSF3 rezoning if they wanted to allow the townhomes.
Okay.
So you can always ask for the rezoning, but with the urban reserve, that would definitely be part of the request, and they could suggest RSF3 rather than RSF2.
Okay, so this wouldn't tie the council's hands in the future. If we felt RSF3 was too high for a given area, that could be pushed back to an RSF2 instead?
Correct, although with this urban conservation district, again, there's no minimum lot size, but what it would trigger is that potential for the townhomes.
Right. Yeah, I would anticipate the first time anybody submits, they'll try to get it as RSF3 if it's not already zoned RSF2. So just want to make sure that we're not tying our hands in the future.
Right.
And then my second question was looking at the potential for, townhomes or twin homes adjacent to other developments. And this is probably a question for council. What do you guys think about the notion of having increased setback requirements if you've got a multifamily unit going up against single-family units? Or maybe you wouldn't just have the 5-foot side lot setback requirement. Maybe that would become a different number. And maybe that's different depending on if it's the twin home versus the townhome.
Say that again?
So under this system, if somebody were to use it for a project, there's no minimum lot size, but we do have setbacks from lot lines. If you're building a development like this, that might have twin homes or townhomes in it, and those are adjacent to single families, would we want to have some kind of an additional setback in that specific kind of layout? So for example, if you've got a townhome up against a single-family home, kind of like what we saw with Ravinia with the Tabors, where there's a side lot setback from their property of about 5 feet, should that, in those cases where it's a different kind of housing, should that become like a 20-foot or a 40-foot setback from adjacent residential properties?
You would probably severely crimp what you could actually do with something when you have a 25% preservation. Just the nature of the storm alone, you're gonna have some type of reduced setback to make the economics work for everybody.
He's talking about just on the first property.
Right, just on the edges.
Yeah, but I mean, you just look at an example. Look at the examples that we have. I mean, if there's existing homes in some of these examples, I mean, they could really, my guess is what it would do is depending upon the lay of the land, it would probably preclude somebody from actually doing it then. Just
Or it would
because
change the
of
orientation.
density with the natural features that are already on it. I mean, like examples here, if you had wetlands and then, per se, the parcels to the, I get to the actual one that's 25%.
So I think to Councilor Nichols' point, it will only impact like this lot, this lot.
This is the standard, if you go to
Oh,
the
sorry.
next one, sorry, Brett. This
No.
one is 25%, doesn't it?
So these have rear lots, they'd already have 20 foot off. So it'd be just the ones that have side yards. Say this was the Tabor property over here, for example. It would affect these two parcels. If the Tabor property was up on the north side, it would affect this parcel. So it wouldn't affect that many lots, potentially. Because most often, you're probably gonna have a rear yard backing up to some other property.
So you're talking about where it abuts existing, not part of the development,
Correct.
different,
Right.
single-family homes versus if it's a townhome or a twin home.
And what it might do is force the orientation. So instead of having a side yard abut an other development, you might have to do a rear yard so that the setback would be the same. Like here, we're calling for a 30-foot setback on the rears, so if you look at the western side, those homes would already have a 30-foot setback from the property line.
Right. And it might push where some of that open space being preserved is, too.
Yeah, you could also end up using the open space in those areas if it's very tricky.
Well, we wouldn't want to split the open space to put open space on the side of these. Why are you using the Tabor example? Are you using it where the cul-de-sac meets down by his property?
Yeah, just because they had a side yard going right up into their larger lot, I believe. So it was a pretty small setback from their lot edge. I think it's pretty far from their home, but
Oh, okay.
But if that had been a rear yard, they would have had the backyard between the homes instead of looking into somebody's side window from the edge of the yard.
I mean, I like it in theory. I think your point on if there's going to be the wiggle room to do it is where it gets tough. But I like the concept of it if we can, to get some more of a buffer between.
And council would be similar to in Ravinia against to Greg Hoagland's home. There's, I think in the cul-de-sac south of you, there actually are homes that have side yards. They're not built yet, I don't think, are they,
I think they might be
In
in
Ravinia?
process.
in Ravinia?
I don't think they are. I think they had to wait till
The last homes in development?
because the street has to go through, because it's a temporary cul-de-sac. I think
Yeah,
that's part
but
of it.
those eventually also would be right up to Greg Hoagland's house if those were constructed too.
Not sure.
So,
And the other way around it would be if you are building a mix of multifamily and single family, it could direct you to put your single families in those locations instead.
Yeah. You want to say something, John?
there has been an idea of buffering different zones. Just, we've talked about that before, period. So like, one of the things that, even a buffer from light industrial to, I don't know, rural, or light industrial to medium density residential. Are there already, and that was one of the things that I thought that we had talked about correcting. So is the conversation around separating zones, would it be best served to have those buffers be within the greater context of separating different zones? Not just a specific conversation for this type of development? Because if we have we want to buffer between all of our zones in some meaningful way, and it's 20 feet, then this would automatically come under the guise of that buffer. Or do we need,
Right.
do we want to delineate specifically in this, is the objective to delineate specifically here? Or should we do that within the context of delineating separately, which is something we've also talked about doing it?
But these would potentially be the same zone, because you would have, they would both be low density. You might end up with like RSF3 up against RSF2, for example.
Yeah, that's what I mean, yeah. I mean, would we historically have wanted a buffer between those two, period?
When we talked about it before, I think it was more in the context of commercial to residential or industrial to residential. I would be open to exploring going beyond that and going to different levels of density within residential too. But I think the bigger need is caused by things like the industrial areas on the north end of the city or the south end of the city that adjoin rural parcels or low-density parcels.
But I guess what you're kind of saying would be that because this would, in areas that might be the same zoning, so let's say it's RSF2 or RSF3, and they were then allowed to do the twin homes or an RSF3, a townhome, suddenly you're getting a housing type that you wouldn't previously have in that zone. In it, so would you want an extra buffer there between the existing, could be the same zone, RSF2, but higher level of,
Well, what's the number?
for,
I don't know, like if you have a house, if you have a regular old house, and then your nearest neighbor can be like 10 feet away, are you gonna say like, well, I need 20 feet if it's a townhouse next to me? Or,
Yeah.
if you drive around town and you look, sometimes there's a delineation, and sometimes there's just not.
Right.
Your neighbor just happens to be a townhouse, or whatever you don't necessarily want to
right, yeah.
have next to you, like, it seems just, I'm just thinking aloud, it just might be a little bit odd.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
Well, especially in that you could have, let's say, for example, this vacant lot here, you put a two-story home on it, that can be, what, 7.5 feet from the lot line in normal zoning?
Yeah, it's 5 and 10, but yeah.
5 and 10, so he could in
5
theory be
feet.
5 feet. Then if a house goes in on the other side, they have to be 10. I mean, you could have townhomes that look similar to the house on the front. But yet, by the nature of it being a townhome or a twin home, it's gotta be further apart. I don't know. Why the big delineation, I mean, between the two? Is it just because of the density of the home?
Yeah, that was the thought.
A twin home's not much more dense, though, than a individual, single-family home.
Yeah, I think if we feel twin homes and single families are equivalent, I could go along with that. I think people would tend to feel differently about townhomes going in next to them, though. So maybe it's just something that would apply if you're doing a townhouse next to a single-family neighborhood.
The Mayor and Councilman Kendra, would that be through the conditional use permit standards then?
Yeah, although I think that you could say, where you say the conditional use permit for townhomes, you could establish that as a standard. If you wanted, otherwise, because then you provide some guideline. The point is to get them to preserve the open space, so it might make sense if that was what you were leaning towards, to add that under section E2 there, and where accessory 2C there talks about conditional uses, those townhomes, and then you could add whatever standards those are. And maybe it's just, need to be 30 feet from the perimeter of the project or whatever.
Now, if you have a 30 feet from the perimeter of the project, that means then, by definition, the townhouses are going to have to be closer together, right? If you're trying to achieve a certain density, you just took away 30 feet from one end of it, maybe the other end too. So the relationship might even be more stark.
Yeah, although, to be fair, townhomes do tend to be, they don't have yards that they use in the same way, so they do tend to put
Sure.
those as close together as they can. The setback might provide the buffer, it might shift them to the other side of the project, depending where it is.
Okay.
And we did limit them, in this case, just as a reminder, to 6-unit row townhomes, so they're smaller townhomes. You can't have the back-to-back like over by Lions Park, as another way to limit the scale of that in this district. I don't think we talked about that specifically, but.
Are you looking for something greater than just this ordinance?
At this point, no. I think maybe next year at the goal-setting session, we can talk about whether it makes sense to look at that in more detail next year.
Okay.
But I wouldn't want to proceed with this unless we agree, that this is how we want it to look. I don't think we have to agree across the whole city, but I think just for this ordinance, we should come to a agreement. And that doesn't have to be today. I mean, maybe if we want to ask staff to come back with some additional drawings of how this would fit into other areas, if that would help people think about it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that, seeing how that, what did you say, 20-foot buffer with?
20 foot, 30 foot, something like that.
Seeing how that would work in practice?
Has this went to planning commission?
No.
They did
We had a
work
joint
session
meeting
with
with
us.
them to talk about it,
Yeah, yep.
early days.
I mean, practically, it would result likely in a couple lots. Either they'd plan for it, or they'd leave them as future lots if an adjacent neighborhood were to develop. Otherwise, you would have a little bit of maybe an extra, gap between properties. It might look a little weird in the neighborhood, but I think it's pretty minimal. You're talking a handful of properties. I'm sensitive to Councilman Nichols' point. I think I'm sensitive to having a home built right up next to an existing, property, as we saw with the tapers there. So I think there's something to it.
Yeah.
So one thing that we have in the OSP ordinance in the rural district is that all structures in the rural district need to have a 100-foot setback from the perimeter of the site. Now, remember, setbacks out there are 50-foot setbacks. They're much bigger setbacks. So it wouldn't be unheard of to say that 20-foot setback around the perimeter of the site, or 25 or 30, or whatever number we're talking about. This is very similar to the OS&P ordinance, and so if it was just a structure setback from the perimeter of the site in that scale, I think it would give developers options to orient the buildings on the site without precluding development.
Very good.
Someone gonna say something? I didn't see who that was.
I just said very good.
Oh, okay.
And I think
Never
Dean's
mind.
stomach rumbled.
All right. Is there any other parts of it that stand out that we want to discuss?
I have a question on I. And it's, well, a couple things. Well, it's I, and then there's subdivision 1.
In the ordinance or in the report?
It's sort of like a,
Ordinance.
it's on page 1, then on page 2. There's locate lots to preserve woodlands, farmland, or other da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It's pretty lengthy. Natural open spaces are not limited to whatever. And then there's, on subdivision 1B, preliminary plat, following pre-application meeting, submit a preliminary plat, required to be submitted, conservation, with the addition of the following: resource inventory presented on an aerial photograph. The question I would have is, some of these things are subjective rather than objective. And so, how do you define how do you define locate lots to preserve woodlands, farmland, it's sort of, to, beauty is in the eye of the beholder sometimes. I think some people might want to look at woodlands, some people might want to look at farmland. Is it in a definition, is it useful to have that in there when we wouldn't actually be able to measure it ourselves, or have It's just a question. It's, when you look at something with, this is what we want, and it's not that clearly defined, it's worth having it in there in the first place. And would we penalize if we said, well, I don't really like I don't like those views? Or is it assumed that with the preservation of space, that those things will be preserved? You know, it's not like, it's not as if when you're designing if you've got 25% of the landmass that's gonna be open, does it really matter what's in there? Or does it have to have
Well, I think,
architectural, archaeological, or cultural value, like,
I feel like some of how we got to that was talking about if we wanted to have something in there that required, if there was like high-quality natural resources on site.
yep,
And that kind of morphed into, you know, putting these as desired things to preserve if they are on site, right? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, really what the first part comes down to, it's talking about the intent of what you're trying to accomplish. So that part certainly maybe is a little softer on the sides, but everything within is really how we get there. So I think it's helpful, I think, for a reader to hear that part, so when they're putting an application together, this is what they're trying to do. Okay, what are the actual requirements of me? And they can help tell the story that way. So I guess that's the way I look at it, Kendra. If you have anything to add
Yeah,
on that.
exactly, but if the objectives, I mean, it has morphed over time, and if the objectives are not accurately reflecting the goals, I think in the OS&P, we specifically say you're only eligible if you are actually in a natural, if you're preserving a significant natural resource area as defined by the comp plan. This was different because I think what you said as a council was, that's not as important as just the open space itself. But if it does have those natural resources, we do want to preserve them.
okay.
But certainly, this can certainly be stripped down if there's things that don't make sense.
I'm okay if it's
Very
just
wordy.
a storytelling quality, rather than, and it's helpful to get that explanation, just kind of tell a story, and I think that's fair. I have issues sometimes with other people telling other people what's the most beautiful part of their property, and it's also, it's funny to me because, like, it's a little personal to me because I'm doing a lot of work on my own property, and I would I at some point may want to change it, and I don't want to have somebody else tell me what to do, since, like, if you think about it from my perspective, even that 25% of the property must be upland, for example. On my property right now, I have 100 acres of upland, more than that. I'm taking 100 acres of upland and I'm creating like 20 acres of wetland on it.
Gotcha.
So at some point in the future, that wetland that I'm creating is going to be used against me if I choose to,
If you choose to develop it with this specific thing, but it wouldn't be replacing the standard.
yeah, yeah, so all I'm saying, it sort of is like, it's one of those things where, like, if you create something nice, you don't want to be penalized for that by as if I couldn't just take out the wetlands. I put them in, I can take them out.
Right.
So it's just something to think about,
Yeah.
that's all.
Makes sense.
Can you take out wetland
I can.
once it's in,
Yes,
once it's put in?
Yep,
How?
by putting culverts in. Yeah, well, that's a different topic for a different day, but Yeah.
You brought it up and stuff, a wetland, if it's identified,
But if it's created and it's not and it's not banked, you can,
but I mean, how long does it take for it to end up getting banked in Hennepin County?
well, in my case, it'll never be banked. I'm not doing it as a part of a bank. But if I wanted my wetlands to go back to ag, I can.
Okay.
So like, in the future, at some point, if Bottom kids want to develop my land, I'll have wetlands on it, but I can drain them if I want,
Gotcha.
and go back to ag if I wanted to.
Right. Makes sense.
So on that case, you bring up a great point. I go the opposite way than the old Paulson property that was all set up and approved. Everything was set in place. And since that has changed hands, that entire woods that was gonna be set aside has now been clear cut.
Right.
So when that 90 acres comes to us, if it ever comes to us again, the 25 acres or the 25% would still be set aside as a preserve then? Is that what this is saying? Or it'd be a different 25%, not something that was a really pretty decent quality woodland.
I think if this,
On that property.
was that in the MUSA?
That was out, that was an OSC.
If it were in the MUSA, then yes, that would be saying that we'd want 25%, and that would be, kind of on the list of things that are desirable that we'd want, so hopefully that would mean they'd submit something that kept that. And I
But
feel like,
outside, we still have nothing that preserves wetlands or woodlands or anything. We have nothing as part of our city ordinances and stuff that would preserve any of those quality things.
Well, wetlands are preserved,
not them in and of,
but in
right,
terms of woodlands,
not them in and of
nothing formal.
themselves, but the
this would
OSP
add
would.
more value to the woodlands than you would get today. Because you could still achieve the same 3 to 5 units per buildable acre without having to cut down the woods on your property to do it.
Which outside of the MUSA is
No, I
the
understand
issue.
that, but we're talking inside of use.
Yeah, so in theory, if this was in place before,
Or Tavera?
No, not Tavera, up on 30 and 101, just north, on the other side of the Lions Park. In theory, they could have preserved more of the woods if they would have.
That was mixed use though, right? You're talking about.
Oh, yeah, that's
Island?
right.
That's the density.
30, you mean 10?
That's right.
Yeah,
10
this is
and
just for
101.
low density.
But if that whole neighborhood that's there and the new stuff coming in as part of that Cook Lake were all one thing, that could have
Yeah,
potentially come.
that's sort of what you're after in designing, crafting this, is to have, is you're saying, if we can meet the Met Council requirements of 3 per, we as a council will allow you to put in smaller lots, so long as you preserve more open space. That's, in the big picture, that's what it's trying to do.
And attempt to preserve some of those, natural features if they're there.
So if we ever come back to this, because it drives at the point of trying to have our town not necessarily look like Maple Grove or whatever, is what people say, then we want to add the buffers to sight lines if we can. And then, the other thing, what was it that you were driving at? You said next time we can look at it next year.
Buffers between different zones.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm 1,000% on board with it. That was one of the first things I wanted to.
I think you guys,
Potential.
3 of you ran on that in particular.
Is there anything in this that says that the open space can't be landlocked by homes? I mean, could you have a cluster of trees in the middle of your 20 acres and somebody puts a street in a circular motion around it and just lines it with homes all the way around it?
I see what you're saying.
Open space, there's a part on page 5 that talks about connecting individual home sites with pedestrian corridors at 1,200-foot intervals along public roadways, and pedestrian corridors between lots at least 55, or 50 feet in width, and buffered from adjacent properties, which now 1,200 feet carried over from OS&P, which might be a little bit long. In hindsight.
It says open space should be accessible to pedestrians, but then it talks about in other spots about the open space can be privately owned.
Well, the open space can either be deeded to the city if it meets certain requirements, or it will be privately owned, either by the HOA or an individual, but it's under a permanent conservation easement, so typically it'll be the HOA. And it says, when it's not deeded to the public, the developer shall provide public access to the open space for all members of the association.
But could they deed it to a land trust and not provide access and not hold it in the HOA?
They could, in theory, provide it to a land trust under item 8 on page 4. It could be owned by an individual, a homeowners association, the city, or other legal entity that will use it for open space purposes. I mean, we could tighten that up.
Is there a downside to being owned by a land trust?
Unless you have a significant chunk of land, the land trust won't take it. The downside to the developer is you got to seed that land trust with a pretty hefty donation. So that's why we don't see a lot of it. It tends to have to be, I don't know if Wild Meadows is,
It's
They
HOA.
are, yeah.
is it still, okay.
I'm pretty sure.
But that is pretty sizable, to your
Yeah.
point.
So, but you could tighten that up a little bit. I mean, I think the idea of an individual owner is probably not likely, given that it's not developable, it's a permanent conservation. So you could change that to just say it's either the homeowners association or another legal entity. Because the only way, I can't imagine if the city's gonna wanna own it if they don't deed it for parkland.
Right.
So you could just change that to be homeowners association or other legal entity.
Yeah, so are we saying then if it's not deeded access to the city, we wouldn't give park dedication?
Correct. We say that if you are not deeding it to the city under this draft, you do not get park dedication for it. I think that was a conversation at the developers roundtable, is they thought, well, I should get the flexibility of the smaller lots and get park dedication. We do not grant park dedication in the OS&P, and this is not drafted to give park credit if we don't own it.
Yeah, they're not really giving up buildable capacity of the land, is the intent, right? So it's not like park dedication where you're taking away buildable area from what they can put homes onto, because we're allowing them to hit their target density for that zone regardless. So I think that's the counter argument. I didn't think of it at the time when we were in the roundtable. But because they're getting the number of homes they can build based upon the overall upland acreage, the fact that 25% are open doesn't cost them future revenue on those sales.
I mean, I'm open to the theory of it, and I'd love to see what it looks like in practice and how it develops out, you know, if you're gonna have single-family homes and then all of a sudden you have this piece of land that's got preservation in it, but then you've got clusters of homes right around it. You're gonna have a lot higher density feel to it in an area.
You can kind of get it in microcosm, I think, by looking at Bellwether, where they have that preserved forest, but the lot sizes are relatively small. It'll probably look somewhat like that. Because there they have 5 feet between homes for parts of it.
Yeah, but that's parkland too, right? So it's all public land, but think about it when it's not open to the public. And that one's kind of more unique in that it's it's the first development in that area, so there's nothing to contrast the two next to it, you know? I think about it, if you thought about it more like, let's say, prime example is a sketch plan that's coming in tonight in the southeast corner. If they wanted to preserve 25% of that and they stuck, you know, high-density homes around it, I mean, I've already seen a flurry of emails talking about the density of the proposed development already, and it's nowhere near what I think we would probably see out of something like this. It's
It should be the same in terms of total numbers.
total numbers, but the perception is, I mean, and that's where we have, right, with this concept, in total numbers, it's the perception based on the type of home that's going in, that the density is gonna be higher,
Yeah.
so.
I think that's particularly the concern with the RSF3 and townhomes, more so than the RSF2 with the twin homes or
Right.
whatever we'd be allowing. Just two-family dwellings, so twin homes,
Yes,
that's it?
yes.
Okay.
Twin homes in the two.
And I think you're gonna see more of a push to more townhome style, the smaller the lot. So if a 20-acre parcel, I think you're gonna have more of a push towards townhomes than you would if you were talking a 60-acre parcel.
Right.
Well, and the intent of this ordinance, the way it's drafted, is to say, we're making it easy for you to do this. So if the council is not comfortable with twin homes and townhomes, we should take them out. Because I think it's disingenuous to say this is a simple plat that you can come in with, acknowledging you are gonna need a rezoning. If you're not gonna support something when it has twin homes and townhomes, that should be part of the, I mean, that was a big part of, I think, tonight's conversation. And, because I think it would be unfair to a developer to say, we've got this simple plat for you, preserve the 25%, and you can come in and do whatever you want, generally. And then, if you're really not comfortable with the idea of either twin homes, two-family homes, or townhomes, you probably should take it out of this draft.
What if a city just said, no townhomes in our city, period?
I think you could say that. I think it would be an interesting conversation to have before you have that, when you think about things like St. Therese and life cycle housing that we've identified as a need. But if you could meet the density goals, you could.
I don't believe in life cycle housing, so that argument doesn't work with me. But I'm just asking the question only because, and by the way, the statistics actually back that there's no such thing as lifestyle housing, but that's the reality of it. If we're against townhouses, we should just be straight and say no townhouse.
Well, certainly in the low-density residential. I mean, I think you have a lot of discretion here. You're providing flexibility to the developer so that you can get something you want, open space. But if you're gonna say, we'll do this, then you're gonna need to do it when the developer comes in. So that's the point, is if you're not comfortable with the idea, you either need to, tonight, provide direction about what would make me comfortable, a larger perimeter setback, or whatever, or there's nothing you can do that I'm gonna like that in the low-density district, then you should just take it out as an option.
Yeah, I think the one thing I'm least comfortable with is the townhouse aspect of it in the RSF3. The other parts I think I'm relatively comfortable with.
I could live with taking out the townhouses.
Yeah, but then the whole concept, it's not gonna be that attractive to a builder. You have to put single-family homes on these.
Or
Twin
twin.
homes.
You'd still have the
homes,
twin
I
home.
guess, right? I suppose.
So that does give you,
I'm totally okay with it might not be fair, but life isn't fair. I'm totally okay with not having townhouses ever built here. But, we should at least be honest about it for anyone who thinks they're gonna come in and put townhouses. You should just say, no townhouses in Corcoran.
Conceptually, I would be okay with townhouses in the right context. But I know a lot of people don't feel that way. And it's okay with me if it's, for the sake of simplicity and ease going forward, we decide within this kind of a concept, we just aren't going to allow it and leave it in the medium areas. Maybe that's just cleaner.
So what if we were to take out the townhouse aspect of it in this draft? The buffer discussion that we had probably could be handled then with kind of what John was talking about in that separate ordinance update that we'd be looking at, I don't know, early next year? Or what did you think of that? Jeremy?
I think that would be a different conversation, because that was more intended for different zones. I think if we feel like it's always going to be okay to have twin homes adjacent to an established single family, we wouldn't need to worry about setbacks. Maybe it's still worth following up with Kendra's concept of we look at what we did in OS&P and you double the normal setbacks
Yeah.
when you're going up against something that's not built with this system. Or you take double the setbacks that are in place in the adjacent parcel.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, so I guess maybe that would be the direction, is let's take out the townhouse aspect of it in RSF 3. And look at including some of that buffer on the change of,
The perimeter setback.
yep.
Of 20, I think, I have to look back, I wrote 20 feet in the ordinance and 30-foot rear yard setback in the staff report, and I'm not sure why I did that. But whatever that rear yard setback is, we could look at that as a perimeter setback.
Sounds good.
And then, the parkland discussion, I think, people were fine taking the parkland if it met certain criteria, otherwise, I think, I didn't hear anybody saying no, the open space should be owned by an HOA or other legal entity. So we'd make that change.
Yeah, I mean, they're basically forcing parkland on the city. The city doesn't want it otherwise.
Would it though? Wouldn't it, we'd only be taking it if it was, met certain requirements,
Yeah,
meaning
we
like it
would
was on
only
our
take it,
comp.
otherwise the HOA would own it, or the land trust, was the intent of that change, I think, to take the city out of it, because right now it says the city could own that open space. And I think we only want the open space if in fact it is, a significant natural resource or a park on our plan.
Do you think a builder would find this, because the more restrictions we have on it, the less attractive it becomes to builders? Like, are we being so specific that we lose potential opportunities for builders to actually do this?
Specific in what, how the open space is managed?
Yeah, that, and also like denying them the ability to put townhouses, period.
I think what we heard from Steph and Jason was if you get rid of the lot restrictions, give me smaller setbacks and smaller lot sizes, I'm interested in looking at it. And if you take the question out of the process, so I'm not having to come in with a PUD because you don't have a code that works for the density I need to get to, then I'm interested. I don't think a lot of the single-family developers would be as worried about the townhome.
Okay.
I mean, the national builders certainly all have a townhome product, but, and Steph does do some with townhomes, but I think if you gave them that flexibility, I think you would get some interest. Just because, believe it or not, developers do not like to come to you with a PUD. They don't like it any more than you do. So if you give them a path to avoid that, I think that it will have some appeal.
Okay. Thank you for helping.
But by what you just said, smaller setbacks, side yards included and such.
Correct. with the larger perimeter setback that we were talking about, this would allow by right, it would have a minimum front yard setback of 20 feet, unless it's adjacent to the major roadways, which still keeps that 100-foot setback.
Okay.
Still have to have a 22-foot driveway in front of your house, which means you can't do a snout house, so you're gonna have to have a much larger setback. And then either 20 or 30-foot rear yard setback, and a 5-yard setback, side yard setback.
5 yards.
Or 5 foot in the interior yards. But then you avoid the issue with the neighboring properties if you add that perimeter setback. So then I'm buying a house in a neighborhood with a 5-yard setback, just like MI, and I'm fine with that. I'm choosing to buy there. But if I live next door, I'm gonna have a buffer to that.
Is 5, is that what the setback is in
MI,
MI's? Up on
Bass Lake.
Bass Lake Road?
Yep.
It's 5 per house though, right?
Yeah, so it's 10 feet.
Which would be
between
here.
buildings.
Yeah.
And it's, honestly, that is very typical from Big Lake to Minneapolis. 5-foot setback is where everything is wanting to go. And so that's why I think you heard Steph and Jason saying, if you do that, I'm interested in giving you open space, because then I can come in and get in and out.
Less expensive for them too. They don't have to.
Yeah, they get the same number of units. They don't have to fight with the council about PUD flexibility
Yeah.
and benefits, and they like that. They like the idea of just a plat. And if we're getting something that we like, open space, natural resource preservation, that's the trade-off.
On the public safety side though, houses that close together and stuff, if one
And I think we'd have to
starts on fire,
get some
it's
review from that
gonna
before we.
spread really close.
Pass.
Yeah, we gotta get
Yeah.
the review from the fire department side.
For sure.
But we've allowed it in several,
Yeah, I know,
We have allowed it, there's nothing in the fire code that prevents it. Once you get less than 5 feet, you need to build that as a firewall. So MI has a product in Dayton that has a 4-foot side yard setback, so each of those detached homes has a firewall on the outside to stop the spread. But 5 feet is not
I've just
required.
seen some of the houses with even the firewall, it still is a tragic event for
Well,
somebody.
fire's always, absolutely, fire's always a.
Somebody that,
event.
it wasn't their home, but it,
Well, when you move into a house, you know how far it is away from your neighborhood,
Yeah.
your neighbors. So like, it's kind of, not that no one deserves to have their house burned down, but it's a assumed risk if you walk in, consciously make a buying decision to
Yeah.
buy a house so close to your neighbors.
So I think so the perimeter setback, delete the townhome option, look at the open space ownership issue, and then I think that question that Alan raised, I'm not sure I got clear direction on it, but the,
fires and stuff, lizards and all that. It's crazy.
can you hide the open space in the middle of the new houses was sort of the issue.
On one side burned down.
Do we want to make some changes to provide open space, more break in the lots, to provide view
And in my
shed,
neighborhood.
or view corridors into the open space, or?
I think we just want to make sure that we're preventing like a giant circle of open space that's built around, right?
Well, it kind of gets into the subjectivity about who decides what's the correct open space. And how is that decided?
In the packet, Kendra had the 2 examples. So this, for example, is the open space that everyone can see versus the one that's tucked away behind all the homes.
I guess the question probably is if it's by right and they're not having to come in with a PUD, what's stopping them from saying, well, this is what we decide is the
Right.
area we want to preserve?
well, it's got to include the natural resource area if there is one, right, that's in here. Honestly, I don't see if it's enclosed by the homes as that being a huge problem, because you will have the 50-foot wide accesses every quarter of a mile, so wildlife can get in and out. I still think it's better than not having the open space at all, like you would see in Plymouth or Maple Grove. I still see it as a value. Because even if you do put it at the edge of your development, the next development that comes in would still enclose it in homes. It's just where the encirclement happens.
You're saying no matter what, it'll be encircled at some point?
I would think.
Yeah.
So I think that's the guidance on the bottom of page 3, that when the natural resource inventory identifies the natural feature, it has to be part of the open space. You could, look at other conditions you wanted to add in there. I mean, do you want it at if this was a parcel that was on a corner of 2 streets, do you want to try to put it there? I mean, what are you trying to accomplish? Do you want to keep it, between, there's competing things, preserve natural resources, the view from the road or the view from the neighbors, and I think that's where it gets a little tricky.
Well, right, part of it's to preserve the aesthetics of the natural beauty of the city, right? But if you surround it with homes on 50-foot or smaller lots, now it just looks like, you might as well look at like Minneapolis or, some other high-density area. You might not even see the open space behind it.
So we could add something about, it should be, to break that part about the 1,200-foot corridor, but something that says the open space must be visible and accessible from public streets, or something like that might help break that.
In that
Avoid
example,
that.
it's not.
No. So you would want to put you would want to put something in there that got you either to this, or on that previous example, put some breaks in the homes. Lose a couple of lots along that north-south street and a lot along that east-west street to get back into that. Because again, if it has to be 50-foot wide, those are 50-foot wide lots, I think. So you put a couple breaks in there to get back there. Because to Councilmember Schultz's point, yeah, this is a private open space for those 15 or so, 20 lots that back up to that.
Right.
But to be fair, Emily spent very little time just trying to draft something to get the lots right.
Well, that's not too bad for,
That open space is grassland, woodland, whatever, no maintenance, zero maintenance on our part as far as city's side, what controls weeds, those kind of things, or I'm
So as
going
part
down
of
the
this,
road of-
the city could take it as parkland if we showed park on our comprehensive plan. We could take it as parkland, or if you just really wanted it, you can always do that. But if it's maintained by the homeowners association, they do have to put a maintenance plan in place, and they do
So
have to do a restoration plan. If it's
It's
just
one
a-
or the other. It's still somebody's gonna be taking care of it.
Yes, if it's just a soybean field and they're not farming it anymore, they need to restore it to a prairie type planting.
Yeah,
and then maintain it.
that's, and that'll all be written in there. so.
Yeah.
I did have a question. We talk about having to create a management plan. Does the city have to review changes to the management plan like we would the HOA agreements and that sort of thing? So that get added also?
I think if they varied and if, say, they were planting it as a wildflower meadow and they wanted to make an orchard, I think that you'd want to review that. I think as part of any native planting, you're going to have some changes that just happen. But, yeah, you could, so generally how we would handle this in our development contract is we put it in there, but we certainly could put something in this about changes need to be reviewed by the city. But we do put that in our development agreement.
So you have 11 on page 7 says, any proposed change in the Articles of Association or Incorporation shall require the prior approval of the city. You could also just put the management plan as an additional item in 11, I think.
Yep.
For sure. Anything else?
Now we can send this to,
Well, I think you're gonna make some more
Well, that's the
tweaks,
question
final
for the
tweaks.
council. These seem fairly minor, frankly.
Okay.
So I certainly can. We can schedule another work session and come back, or we can bring it to the public hearing at the planning commission, get their feedback, and you still have a chance to modify it. But I feel like these were pretty clear changes. I'm not sure.
Do we wanna just do
want-
that, and if there's something that comes up, we can
yeah,
take that after the fact? Okay.
I think it's good.
Let's do that.
Okay, so we will schedule this for the January Planning Commission and then bring it back to you on the January 27th meeting.
Sounds good.
Excellent. Thank you, Kendra. Good work on this.
Thank you.
Brad, you're gonna have to come back for that one.
I add so much value to this, yeah.
Alright.
You have to finish everything that you started.
Everything.
Now you're here, of course.
Unscheduled items, I would say we don't have anything, so, can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.